Ready for a deep dive? We're going to explore how feminism completely reshaped psychology. You might be surprised by what we uncover about women and their minds.
It's a story of resilience, groundbreaking research, challenging deeply ingrained biases.
We'll be using García Dauder's work to guide us.
Oh, yeah, their paper, The Feminist Critical Theory as an Epistemic Corrective in Psychology.
That's the one. It really highlights how feminist thought forced psychology to confront its blind spots.
It's like feminism took one look at the field and said, okay, time for a serious reality check.
And when did this reality check begin?
Well, we can trace it back to the early 20th century.
A time when just being a woman in psychology was a challenge in itself.
Right. Let's just say it wasn't the warmest welcome. But even then, some incredible women were already making their mark.
Like Mary Calkins and Margaret Washburn, becoming president of the American Psychological Association, the APA, back then. That's huge.
Absolutely. Shows you how brilliant and determined they were.
They weren't just trying to get a seat at the table.
They led the conversation.
Publishing important research, mentoring a new generation of psychologists.
Exactly. They were paving the way, even with all the obstacles.
Resilience seems to be a common thread with these early women.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
And their own experiences really shaped the research they did. So while men were often focused on more theoretical psychology in universities,
The women were often pushed towards applied psychology,
Right.
more practical applications.
right. For example, the women of the Chicago School, they were doing amazing research on how exploitative labor practices impacted women.
They were using their expertise to fight for social justice. So powerful.
And they even influenced policy changes like work hour regulations. But it wasn't just social issues. They were also taking on some pretty wild theories about women.
You mean those sexist theories that were everywhere back then?
Exactly. Like the idea that higher education was dangerous for women's health.
You're kidding. Dangerous how?
They actually thought that if women pursued intellectual activities, it would drain energy from their reproductive system.
It sounds comical now, but I know it wasn't a laughing matter back then. It was used to limit women's opportunities.
Exactly. They called it the uterus-brain inversion hypothesis. Can you believe that?
So how did they challenge this ridiculous theory?
With hard data. In 1882, a group of women, a lot of them early psychologists, they got together and formed the Association of Collegiate Alumni, the ACA.
Okay, so fighting back with research, I like it. What did they do?
They conducted a huge survey of almost 1,300 women who graduated college, asking about their health and well-being.
Cutting right to the chase, what did they find?
The results were clear. The vast majority of the women, about 78%, said they were in excellent health. They completely debunked the myth.
That's amazing. They were not messing around. It reminds me of Lita Stetter Hollingworth taking on those who said women were just intellectually inferior, especially during that time of the month.
Oh, she was incredible. Hollingworth dedicated her whole career to debunking those myths about women's abilities. She'd experienced firsthand how those ideas could limit opportunities.
And she wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. One of my favorite quotes from her is, "It is a subject upon which nothing final can be known until it is studied by women upon women."
She was so ahead of her time.
She knew that to really understand women's experiences, you had to include women in the research.
It's a core idea in feminist psychology, emphasizing lived experience. And it brings us to another harmful theory. Those pioneers tackled the variability hypothesis.
The idea that men had more variability in their abilities, so naturally you'd find more men at the extremes, both geniuses and, well, not so geniuses.
Yeah.
But it was really just a way to explain away the lack of female geniuses, right? Like some natural phenomenon.
And of course, it was used to justify keeping women's opportunities limited. It was frustrating for these pioneering women, to say the least.
So before the break, we were uncovering how those incredible women were already pushing back against bias in psychology.
And things really started to shift in the 1970s.
With the second wave of feminism, right?
Exactly. This wave of activism brought so much energy, such a demand for change.
And it touched everything. Psychology couldn't ignore it.
Oh, absolutely not. It led to some vital spaces for feminist scholarship.
Like what kind of changes did we see within the field?
Well, for one, the Association for Women Psychologists was formed.
The AWP, right, in
Yeah.
1969.
Yep, and that, along with journals like Sex Roles and Psychology of Women Quarterly.
It gave them a platform for research and voices that had been ignored for too long.
It was a breath of fresh air. And it wasn't just academic. Feminist psychologists were also changing how therapy was done. This is where the personal is political comes in.
Right, that idea challenges the old way of therapy, where women's problems were seen as separate from everything else going on in their lives.
Yes. Feminist therapy understood that women's struggles were often because of oppression, discrimination.
The roles they were expected to play in society?
Exactly. It's not just what's going on inside your head. It's about understanding a woman's experience in a system that often tells her she's less than.
Instead of asking what's wrong with you, it's asking what's wrong with the world you're living in.
Yes. And one of the most powerful tools to come from this was the rise of consciousness-raising groups.
Women coming together, sharing their experiences, so important.
It was huge. They realized they weren't alone in those struggles.
There's something so powerful about recognizing that shared experience, finding strength in those numbers.
Absolutely. And as they talked, they started to see those common threads, how their struggles were linked to social and political realities.
So, for example, they might come together to talk about something like body image.
Right. Or feeling stuck in their roles at home. Things that might have been dismissed before as women's problems.
Instead of systemic issues that need attention.
Exactly. But as they went deeper, they saw how these personal struggles were connected to societal expectations, how the media portrays women.
And that realization is so empowering, isn't it?
It is. It allows women to shift from blaming themselves to questioning those systems that are keeping them trapped.
And that empowerment had ripple effects, right?
Oh, absolutely. It fueled their activism, pushing them to fight for things like reproductive rights. They were making those connections between their inner world and the world out there.
It's amazing to think about these intimate conversations sparking a movement. And we can't forget Phyllis Chesler, her appearance at that 1969 APA conference, demanding reparations for women harmed by sexist therapy. That was huge.
She was amazing. She didn't hold back, called out the field for perpetuating those stereotypes.
And it wasn't just talk. This was about real harm being done to women in the mental health system.
Exactly. And feminists were shining a light on how traditional therapy often pathologized women just for not fitting those gender norms or expressing their distress.
It's what we call androcentrism, isn't it? When the male perspective is the default.
Yes. And it had consequences for women seeking help, misdiagnoses, treatments that weren't effective.
Feeling completely misunderstood.
Women were told their experiences were wrong, that they were the problem, when really they were reacting normally to oppressive situations.
So it's no wonder so many women felt alienated by traditional therapy.
Their pain was dismissed. And it wasn't just about misinterpreting those experiences, it was failing to even consider the context.
Right, like they were missing the bigger picture.
Exactly. A perfect example of this is Gloria.
Gloria.
She was a woman who did a series of therapy sessions in the 1960s, and they were filmed.
We can actually see these sessions.
We can. And it's fascinating to see how each therapist representing different schools of thought.
Okay.
They all missed the mark in understanding her struggles. Focusing on her inner world, her thoughts and feelings, but not the social pressures she was dealing with as a woman.
They were so focused on her psyche that they forgot she was a real person living in a complex world.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a few therapists, it was systemic.
It's about changing how we think about mental health entirely, which I'm guessing wasn't always welcomed.
Oh, it was a radical shift, definitely met with some resistance. But the feminist critique was undeniable. It made the field face those uncomfortable truths. And it wasn't just about sexist interpretations. It was also about exposing harmful practices within therapy.
And this is where Rachel Hare-Mustin's work is so important, researching sexual contact in therapy.
In 1974, she published an article challenging the attitude towards therapist-patient sexual relationships.
Which, shockingly, weren't uncommon back then.
I know. It's a dark part of mental health history. But Hare-Mustin's work was so important. She exposed the devastating impact of those power imbalances.
And thankfully, her work and the advocacy of countless others led to the APA changing its ethical guidelines.
In 1977, they explicitly banned sexual contact between therapists and clients.
A monumental victory, for sure.
It shows what speaking up can do. Feminist psychology wasn't just influencing the field, it was changing lives.
Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we were talking about feminist psychology's impact on mental health, really shining a light on some tough issues.
And how it really pushed for ethical standards, which is so important.
Absolutely. But now, get ready to have your minds blown because we're diving into how feminist psychologists tackled the very idea of gender.
They didn't just want a seat at the table. They started questioning the table itself.
I love that.
They really started dissecting those rigid categories of male and female.
The boxes we put ourselves in.
Exactly. And one of the first things they challenged, those old school masculinity, femininity tests.
The ones that try to measure how manly or womanly you are.
Exactly, with a bunch of subjective questions. It's like, do you prefer kittens or sports cars?
Right. Are you more likely to cry during a sad movie or build a deck? It all seems so simplistic.
And ridiculous, right. But the problem was, they weren't just silly quizzes.
They were being used for serious stuff.
They were used to make judgments about people's mental health, their careers, even their sexual orientation.
Wow. Using science to justify discrimination.
It's frustrating, right? And feminist psychologists like Sandra Bem really lived the charge in showing how flawed those tests were.
Because they were based on stereotypes.
Yes, outdated stereotypes about what men and women are supposed to be like. And they reinforced this idea that masculinity and femininity were opposites on a line.
So you could only be one or the other. No in between.
Exactly. And Bem proposed a much more nuanced understanding of gender. Instead of that single line, she said, what about a two-dimensional model?
So you could be high in both, low in both.
Exactly. Any combination.
Now that makes sense.
Right. It acknowledged the complexity.
We contain multitudes. Which brings us to the groundbreaking work of Suzanne Kessler and Wendy McKenna.
Their book, Gender, an ethnomethodological approach, is a classic. They challenge the very idea that gender is something you're just born with.
It's more about how we express ourselves in the world.
Exactly. It's about the way we talk, the clothes we wear, our behavior, those subtle signals we give off. But they went even further, saying that even the idea of two distinct sexes, male and female, is a social construct.
Wait, are they saying that biological sex is a social construct too?
Well, they argued that while there are biological differences between bodies, how we understand those differences is influenced by our culture, by society.
So it's not just about our physical traits, but the meaning we attach to them.
Yes. And that was huge back then. This idea challenged everything about how people thought about sex and gender. And you can imagine it really shifted how we see transgender experiences.
Because it moves away from seeing it as a medical problem or a disorder.
Yes. It recognizes it as a valid expression of gender identity. Instead of asking what's wrong with the transgender person, it asks, what if the problem is a society that doesn't accept their experience?
What a powerful shift.
It was a turning point. And it led to a much more affirming and inclusive approach to gender diversity.
So we've journeyed from those early pioneers fighting for their place in psychology to these incredible thinkers who revolutionize how we understand gender itself.
And it all shows how feminist psychology wasn't just about adding women to the field. It was about changing the field entirely.
It's about recognizing that our inner world, our thoughts and feelings are always connected to what's happening in the world around us.
The personal is political. And we can't ignore how much social structures influence our sense of self.
And this is where it gets really important, recognizing that knowledge isn't neutral. The questions we ask, the research we do, even our interpretations, it's all shaped by our own experiences.
Which is why it's so crucial to have different voices, different perspectives in the room.
Challenging assumptions, pushing the field to grow.
Because the more we truly understand about ourselves as humans, the better we can create a more just world for everyone.
Such an amazing conversation. We hope this deep dive has inspired you to think critically about the world around you, to question assumptions, and stay open to new perspectives. And remember, there's always more to discover when you dive deep.